Hi, I'm here in the HARPA exhibition hall in Reykjavik with Professor Tim Noakes, who I'm delighted to meet again. I know we met in Africa and that was an honour.
Thank you, I'm
You're welcome. And Professor Noakes has of course been a leading light in bringing kind of more science-based nutritional information to the world. And I think originally you had a kind of a road to Damascus conversion, which, if I'm correct, was over a relatively short period of time, over weeks, after maybe decades talking about high carb being best.
Yeah, indeed. I started on the high carb diet in 1977 because I was working with cardiologists, and of course they told us you have to eat low fat diet. And I went on till the 12th of December 2010, and that was the day when I'd just written a book. I'd finished up the book, waterlogged, sent it off, and I went out for a run. I had a terrible run. I came home and I saw advertised the book by Westman and his colleagues called The New Atkins for the New You. And it claimed that you lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks without hunger. And what interested me was I knew they were good scientists, and I said, but they've sold out to Atkins. Atkins was the guy who killed us. So what have they done? I said, I have to find out. There's a paradox here. So I went and bought the book, read it, and within 2 hours I saw that all the information about the low carb diet had been hidden from us. Right. And so I decided that was it. I was going to try it, and I did so well on it that I just stuck with it for the last 6 years now.
And that book, obviously, it had some pretty good science in it, not just the diet. It went into some depth.
Indeed. It said something like 150 studies showing the benefits of low carbohydrate diets. And I said, here I'm I'm a researcher in nutrition, and I've never read any of them. What's the problem? And I understood that it had been suppressed, all that information had been suppressed by our usual education. Okay. And I don't think it was particularly active, it was just hidden. And because the people weren't talking about it, you never got to see it. But it was in good journals, and I realized they couldn't have produced all this good body of evidence if there wasn't real science behind it, and if it didn't have some meaning.
Right, exactly. And then you went on to become a huge force in getting this material out there, or this message out there. And just in terms of what drove you, I know part of it would have been for scientific truth. I'm sure you were quite annoyed at having been wrong for decades when the data's there. But part of it also, I think, you have a huge personal drive, I think, to save. We've got millions of people now suffering with metabolic disease. And you mentioned your father earlier also being affected.
Yeah, my father was a key player because he had got the metabolic syndrome. He was always overweight. And even when I go back to his history at his school, they used to report that he was the big guy. But interestingly, he was the big athlete. He was the guy who did all the exercise, and he won the shot put for 2 years in a row at his high school. But yet they called him big, but when he was big, he wasn't fat in those days, but he did develop the metabolic syndrome and developed type 2 diabetes. And under my watch, he became sicker and sicker. And we allowed him, because of ignorance, to eat a high carbohydrate diet, because that's what he was forced to eat. And I watched him die and didn't realize, because I was taught that this diabetes is an irreversible condition, just gets worse. So he was showing the normal pattern. And I realized, no, that's nonsense. It's not the normal pattern. It's just because of the high carbohydrate diet that was driving him to get sicker. So that was a big factor. And I guess it was the guilt, but you can't ever assuage that guilt. But I mean, I only realized the guilt in 2010 when I suddenly changed, and I suddenly realized, my gosh, I was party to his death in that way. And if I'd known when he was sick what I know now, we could have prolonged his life and spared him much harm and unhappiness. So there's a feeling of guilt there. But I think what happened was I got targeted, and I had to defend myself. And I didn't understand. I said, but here's the evidence. I'm only saying and then no one would see the evidence. And that's driven me even more. That the evidence I could see, and it was so obvious.
Yeah, it is quite shocking in some ways. I mean, my own father got his first heart attack in his 60s. He died at 72, which is quite young. Now, he didn't have diabetes, but of course he did have diabetes. Yeah. He was probably hyperinsulinemic for 20, 30 years. But when I had similar liver measurements came in high, it didn't take too long to research the databases and realize, oh, the answer to this is largely there. Yeah. And so I suppose similarly, it's just so frustrating that it's not out there and known. And in the early, when you then very quickly began to look at putting a book together to get this out there, I guess.
You know, you're quite right. I did, but not in the form it came out. Okay. So I was busy writing a book, which I suddenly rediscovered a few weeks ago. And I'd been working it on a computer. But anyway, the point was that on a particular day, I was contacted by John O'Proudfoot, who's a chef, and he said he'd like me to write the foreword to the book, The Real Meal Revolution. And I said, after a few weeks, I said, no, John, let me write more than that. And then it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it was the conclusion to the book. And I think maybe it did play a big role in getting the book to become so popular. But it sold 250,000 copies in South Africa. It's now been distributed. It's sold about 30,000 in the United Kingdom, which is still low, but at least it's growing. Right. And I think the UK is a little bit behind. But it completely changed the nutrition landscape in South Africa because it became the major talking point for the past 3 years. And I get stopped, for example, when I got on the plane here to come to Iceland, I handed in my passport to the guy at the passport said, "Are you Professor Noakes?" So I said, "Yes," and then we had a 20-minute discussion on his diet. And this is at customs. And that's how it happens. I get, I'm forever getting stopped, and people thank me for what I've done. But it's just got the discussion going. So what happened now, my colleagues will say, oh, well, of course we know sugar's bad, and we know refined carbohydrates, but you can't promote a high-fat diet. So they're slowly changing, but it's going to take a long time for the reasons that we discussed today. The influence of industry on their position and what they believe and what they teach.
And there is, in fact, there's enormous sums invested in the current paradigm, so there's a lot of backlash. But you've kind of become the lightning rod. You've had to take an enormous amount of heat. And I don't know if you're able to really talk about it, but you're to the point of you've been on trial effectively, yes. And is that kind of in camera, or can you discuss that? Okay.
No, we've exposed that as much as we possibly can. So it was clear now when we looked that over the past 3 years, my profession, to some extent my colleagues at my own university and certain other people like the dietitians of South Africa have targeted me, and they were looking for some excuse to have me exposed and publicly humiliated. I mean, that's what my wife has said. My own university wanted me publicly humiliated, and so that was quite tough. And anyway, it came down to a tweet that I did in which I suggested that a mother, in fact, the key point to show how stupid it is, in the dietitians of South Africa have rules that if it's a we question, what can we do or what should we do, anyone can answer it. You do not have to see the patient, you don't have to examine them. If it's an I question, a dietitian may not answer that question, they have to get it referred by a doctor. So the equivalent would be that if it's an I question, probably the doctor should consult the patient and examine the patient and then give advice. The point is that this question was a we question. It said, should mothers and babies go on a low-carb diet after pregnancy, you see? And so I answered it and had one throwaway 7-word sentence in which I said the key is to wean onto the the low-carb, high-fat diet. And that was it. That was the 7 words. And that has spawned this 25-day hearing into my conduct, because it was said that I was disgraceful conduct and so on. And I mean, it was completely manufactured. And fortunately, we turned it into a trial of them, not of me.
True, and it went quite well in that respect, and rightly so. Is it actually wrapped up, the proceeding now, awaiting judgment, or? We
have another 8 days. Okay. I'm going to be cross-examined, so I spent 5.5 days presenting the evidence, and which I don't think anyone's ever done. It was a mini course on low-carb, high-fat diets, and I was able to put everything I knew on the table and make these lawyers listen to it for 5.5 days. Now the lawyer has to come and cross-examine me on that. It's going to be interesting to see what he comes up with. And we're going to have 1 or 2 very high-profile world authorities are going to come and give evidence on my behalf.
Oh, physically, and not just by video?
No, they're going to come to Cape Town. Excellent. And you know who they are, but we don't want to let the opposition know until the last minute.
Well, there's a growing number of excellent individuals who understand the science, so they won't be able to guess, I'd say. There's so many.
That's correct. Yeah.
Call us legion, for we are many, I think, from the Bible. And the whole revolution, well, the kind of thing that's gone on in your case, you've just described, that's actually going to turn out to be helpful in ways to move things forward. In terms of the time frame you mentioned, it's going to be a long time. And I wonder when will be the inflection point when enough people from the other side will begin to kind of leave the sinking ship, that it will kind of flip over and everyone's kind of going to go running.
You know, let me just say what's happened in South Africa. So we sold this 250,000 books, and we estimate between 2 and 3 million South Africans have adapted to the Banting diet. And that's give you an idea, but the penetration is just through the higher socioeconomic classes. Yeah. That's the reality. And so we realize that. So now we're starting targeting the poorer communities, and we have a program called the Eat Better South Africa campaign, where we are getting poorer communities to eat Banting diet for very little. Yeah. And we're going to partner up with one of the major food chains in South Africa to drive this. So this is interesting because they're selling the bad foods. They say, but this is what the people can afford. We have to change what we provide to them. But that's going to take time. So anyway, that's that group. And the next thing we're doing is starting targeting the doctors, because the doctors, I think, are going to change. But they're scared, they don't really know. And so I've been demonized, but a lot of people have realized that what I'm saying is correct, because patients come and say, gosh, the doctor says you lost 30 kilograms. Again, another story, as I got on the plane, lady came, she cried to me and she said, you know, I've lost 20 kilograms, I'm off my hypertensive medication, it's just amazing. So I said, what did your doctor say? So she said, well, he said, it works for you, so you just keep doing it. Not it works for everyone, it works for you. So he's already, at least he knows it works for one person.
As he sees more and as it grows, there will be a tipping point somewhere. Yeah. It'll be interesting.
So that's the one thing, the patients are educating the doctors, but there's another component. So that although I'm not allowed to talk to the academics at the University of Cape Town Medical School, I speak to the medical students. And why? Because their parents have adapted the diet, they've got healthy, and their children see it. And now the children are the young medical students, and they told, well, the Banting diet's dangerous, it's going to kill you. And they say, but hold it, my dad's diabetes improved, he reversed his obesity, how can you tell me it's dangerous? So there's a questioning that's happening.
With the next generation, that is where the hope is. And even we did an event in Dublin and there were a few medical students just came out.
I heard that was very successful.
Well, it was a good start for Ireland, yeah, but to have the medical students, and they freely admitted publicly with a couple of hundred people there, admitted, look, we're not really taught anything in nutrition. And we discussed at length hyperinsulinemia and the proper diagnosis for diabetes, and they admitted again, we're not doing that diagnosis, we don't get taught. So there was all this revelation, and they really were into it.
Yeah. I was in Dublin last year, and it's really interesting because the expert on childhood obesity put up a slide. He said he has a normal child, he has an obese child, and the insulin was 5 times higher in the obese child. And I remember that because a doctor said, you know, I've got these people who've got they've got hypertension and they're overweight, but I'm too scared to tell them they're overweight. I said, but it's simple, you just tell them they've got insulin resistance. That's it, and then you address it. But it was really interesting, by the end of the period that we were there for, they were definitely talking about low-carb diets and insulin resistance and so on. Yeah. Whereas before, the paper that very day had a story of rising obesity rates in Ireland, exercise more, eat less. By the time of the end of the talk, they were sort of saying, well, actually, maybe nutrition's got something to do with it.
Yeah, and it's a condition of sorts. It's not just the sloth and gluttony, which is so offensive, really, when you think people are actually ill with the condition and you know the broad root causes and you say they're lazy. Yeah. It's kind of disgusting.
Well, yeah, and because I'm a classic example. So I was lean up till probably the mid-40s, and then I put on weight. But I've been running all these marathons, and now I'm lean again. And so how can you change your personality? So it wasn't the personality change, it was just the food choices.
Yeah, and the nutrition that's grossly under-recognized as causal for all of this stuff. It's interesting that the AHA, I just posted something the other day, but the American Heart Association 2015, and buried on page 7 or 8, have now actually captured that the 5 low-fat trials all failed. They've written it down. And they've also captured that 5% of saturated fat replaced with 5% carbohydrate will increase risk for heart disease. So in a sense, even the great driver of low-fat diets is documenting, which is probably a pretty big step, but it's not really they're not saying it loudly.
No, they can't.
They can't.
They can't. It's going to be a slow process. I know I worry about my own medical faculty because they clearly is so entrenched that it's very difficult for them to change. And I mean, I raised here the issue of Big Pharma has such a powerful influence. And it's only going to grow because the money's becoming tighter at the medical schools.
There'll be desperation, yeah, will creep in. But the internet is allowing a lot of information out. It's allowing propaganda out for one side, the existing side, but it's also allowing a lot of knowledge to get shared from your side or whatever. And I think it was either in your talk or someone else's today, and it was really an excellent day, by the way, here in Iceland. It was a fantastic event, fantastic talk. But someone did bring up something I was intrigued by in the last couple of months, that 52% now of adult Americans are pre-diabetic or diabetic, which I think I'm sure you'd agree, or you would say it's all diabetic physiology. Yeah. And that's a minimum because that's using glucose metrics. But if you used insulin metrics, more accurate, it could be 65, 70% maybe?
Absolutely. That's the number I come to. What is really interesting, so now I wrote a book called Challenging Beliefs, which ended. And what really got me into trouble was I added a chapter on nutrition. So when I converted in 2010, I added this extra chapter in 2012 to the next edition of my book, Challenging Beliefs, which is kind of my autobiography. And there I spoke about my change and why I did it, and that the fact that statins don't prevent heart disease or cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. And that was when people started targeting me. So what I'm doing now is I'm writing the next story from 2012 to 2016 and going through it. And one of the moments that was depressing for me was I had a debate with another professor who they'd flown out, in fact, who was head of the Women's Health Initiative. Now, the Women's Health Initiative disproved the low-fat diet. And this guy was invited to come out and tell me that the low-fat diet is the way to go. So it's astonishing that my own university should use him as the proponent of the idea that the low-fat diet's healthy.
When he had presided over the WHI, which was a couple of $100 million, I think.
$700 million.
Oh, is it that? I've heard lots of figures. Yeah. Okay. And that came out straight, and they did achieve the lowering of fat from 35 to I think 26 or 7. They did achieve the biomarkers that reflected that, and it completely failed.
And so their explanation was, well, we didn't get cholesterol low enough. And they avoided the null hypothesis, that basically they had a hypothesis, they should have tested it. And anyway, so we had the debate, and I've gone back on the evidence and what he said, and he said, well, about 6% of the population have insulin resistance.
6?
So 6%. So I said, well, it's actually 60%. And that was, I said, in 2012. And it just shows that the man has no clue about insulin resistance. It's not taught. How can the guy who heads up this major trial know nothing about insulin resistance? Because they're so brainwashed into the cholesterol story. But there's another side to it. You know, if they had done a high-fat leg to that trial, because now there was a paper published this last week on statins, and they found that statins had no effect in the people on the low-fat side of the trial. With the statins in the women, there was no benefit. Okay. That was just published. Now imagine if they'd had statins versus the low-carb diet.
A properly formulated
in that Women's Health Initiative. Imagine, retrospectively, they could have gone back, and although it wasn't a randomized trial, they would have found people who were on statins versus people who weren't on statins, and seen what the outcomes were. And see if the low-carb diet would have done better than the statins.
Which... well, anyway, I'd be biased from my understanding of the science.
But you know what I realized? I realized that the Women's Health Initiative was set up to win the Nobel Prize. Okay. That's why they put $700 million behind it. And the goal was that they were going to win the Nobel Prize by showing that the low-fat diet worked, and then that would have confirmed everything that was required about the dietary guidelines. That's why they did it. And when it failed, they just covered up and just ignored it.
Just moved on. I think, as Professor Richard Feynman said, it was actually a success because it refuted the hypothesis and it would allow you to move on. But of course, that's not what happened. That answer is just not acceptable. Yeah, it's crazy stuff. And on these 60 or 70%, arguably, of adult Americans, and the rest of the world is following along nicely, if diabetics, as diagnosed as full diabetics by glucose metrics, have 6 to 8 times the heart disease, and then you have to extend your diabetics right out to 60 or 70%, you'd want to, if it was a technical problem, an engineering problem, you'd have to be really careful you eliminated all diabetes, insulin resistance before you look for secondary causes of cardiovascular. And the question is, well, what's left as the secondary causes? I can't get that answer from anyone, including Thomas Dayspring or anyone else. Have you any evidence where people with high insulin sensitivity and appropriate response to glucose with profound atherosclerosis? Not sure it exists.
Yeah, there would be no data on that one. That's a great question. One of the points we were discussing today, which I maybe didn't emphasize enough, is that when you go back and look for the association, the value, the hazard ratio for cholesterol, it is so low, it's utterly meaningless. And yet, when I show that to cardiologists, it's like, so you put insulin resistance and diabetes, metabolic syndrome high up, and then way down is cholesterol. I say, but how can you focus on this one and ignore those? And it's like you didn't ask the question. They just gloss over. They don't see it.
They're wearing their cholesterol glasses. Yeah.
It's frightening because the person who put me on the low carb, low fat diet, I should say, was Professor Lionel Opie, we've had a great relationship with him. And I only realize now that he can't change his mind. He's been a cholesterol man all his life, and he would never change. Although he said, some of what you say is correct, he could never admit that more than a little bit was correct.
And this is a huge problem because there's a lot of collusion, as you say, and there's funding of education is a disaster. But there's also the professional pride, and it is a big human thing, especially for academics. A lot of their self-worth is built on that. It must be really hard, even countenancing that you've been wrong for 40 years on something fundamental. That's really hard.
Yeah, I think it's probably impossible for the vast majority. It must be so difficult. In my case, I was lucky that I only had, as my wife says, you only had to take a few chapters out of your book. You didn't have to throw the whole book away.
Yeah, it was self-contained, the bad bit. It wasn't spread throughout.
So that I still had the credibility of the other stuff. But if your whole life has been prescribing statins for high cholesterol, and that's all you've ever done. The interesting thing, I've been in cardiac rehabilitation. I started the first cardiac rehabilitation clinic in South Africa in 1977 or so. And what was interesting was that the cardiologists never referred these patients, although we charged nothing, or essentially nothing. And we would have a total program, including nutrition. Of course, it was the wrong nutrition, but exercise, relaxation, and so on, everything. No one was interested. The cardiologists weren't interested. And I've realized cardiologists have never been interested in prevention. And so when we come along and say, actually, you can prevent the disease by changing the diet, it's not of interest to them.
Yeah, and I think someone raised on the last event, in a sense, there's an inherent conflict of interest, not just with pharmaceutical companies, but themselves. They are paid for intervention, and they would lose money if everyone prevented incidents.
Exactly.
So they're kind of caught up.
So the lecture I gave today, the advance that in my own thinking, which came about also as I was researching the evidence for my hearing, is that it's fatty liver which causes the atherogenic dyslipidemia. And I think that was really interesting because the hepatologists, the liver specialists, have fallen upon it by error. And in this particular study, as you know, they did liver biopsies. Yeah. And that's what, doing liver biopsies in 200 people, I wouldn't do it on one person because it's such a high risk. So they did their 200 biopsies, and then they found that if you had the fatty liver, that was the relationship with atherogenic dyslipidemia. So now we've got the direct link between high carbohydrate diets and atherogenic dyslipidemia. So it's really now, it's not the diet-heart hypothesis, it's the diet-liver-heart hypothesis.
Absolutely.
And that's now, the irony is the cardiologists aren't going to be the people looking after your heart, it's going to be the lipid specialists. And they will eventually, because they're not committed to the cholesterol theory, they will fall upon it that it's actually carbohydrates causing the problem. And that's going to be a moment, a great moment, because it will be now the hepatologist versus the cardiologists, not us as nutritionists and so on, against the cardiologists.
That is a crucial link. And yeah, the endocrinologists and the hepatologists, I mean, they're sitting on a gold mine in a way.
Exactly.
Because if they can be hugely effective with all their patients and seem to be, you know, they'll actually be financially incentivized to do the right thing as opposed to the cardios.
Exactly.
But timing, well, we'll see.
I had a few weeks ago, I had another moment, great moment. So I was originally funded by a company called Discovery Health in South Africa, which also acts in Europe and the United Kingdom and in the United States. And when I converted from the high carb to the high fat diet, they weren't very happy because they reward people for being healthy, but to be healthy you have to eat the low fat diet. So I came along and said, actually, low carbohydrate diet is better. And that didn't go down well. And whenever we spoke, although I was their funded professor, they were kind of getting a little bit further away from me until I retired. And one of their senior officials, senior managers, I met him a few weeks ago and he said, Tim, I want to apologize to you because we never took you seriously. And I said, well, so what happened? So his daughter developed type 1 diabetes. And all of a sudden, within a week, they converted from vegetarianism, high carbohydrate diets. They just got rid of all the carbohydrate in their pantries and so on, and converted to the high fat diet. And the daughter's diabetes is well controlled. She doesn't require insulin at the moment, but she will require insulin sometime. But it was just amazing. And you know, that's the sort of thing that has to happen. You have to have this tragic person, as I had with my father, and in a sense with my own health, and then you start to realize.
Well, you've got to multiply it by millions, tens of millions, arguably kind of hundreds of millions now is a fair, it sounds a bit outrageous, but you're talking hundreds of millions of people who are making themselves sick by following the official advice in Western world. It's bizarre.
And the most important is for them to question, just to question.
Yes. Dig.
You know, and ask, so these people are now saying I should be on a high-fat diet. How can that possibly be? How can it be so different from what I was taught? And I've realized that we're each an anecdote, we're each an individual experience, and we have to find it out for ourselves. And the reason I'm so active on social media is I just want people to see the evidence and decide and try it, and if it doesn't work, that's fine. Do something else. But for goodness sake, don't be like me and sit there for 40 years doing the wrong thing because you didn't know. If there'd been a Tim Noakes around 40 years ago, I wouldn't have type 2 diabetes now. I would have said, gosh, let's try it.
And you would have known how to monitor your bloods to make sure you're on the right track. And that's the other thing as well. People, I mean, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and you referred to it earlier, in terms of the bloods, the ratio of triglyceride to HDL and insulin, of course, after glucose. There's a lot of fairly basic measurements that people can actually use to validate that they're doing the right thing. Even if they're not 100% sure about high fat, they say, well, all my blood metrics are going to a better place. So there's probably an opportunity there to educate people too.
And you know, the simple one which we don't talk about is blood pressure. And your blood pressure normalizes. You know, once your blood pressure is normal, you're probably doing the right thing. And that's what happened to me. I always had marginally high blood pressure. And it just came, and where we're working in poorer communities, as soon as we take the sugar out and the refined carbohydrates, the blood pressure just comes. That's the first thing that goes. Long before they lose weight, the blood pressure comes down and they can chuck their medications away.
Actually, and that's a great point, because similarly for me, when I did triathlons, the blood pressure came down, but I was still pulling 88 kilos. With no exercise regime in 10 weeks, I dropped 15 kilos, but the blood pressure in the first week or two, and I noted that, fell long before the weight.
Exactly.
Because it's the chemistry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you know what we've learned in the poorer communities, how much money they waste on medicines and travel and time in the hospitals collecting their medicines. They call it their party pack. So once a month, they go to collect their party pack of medications, which makes no difference. And they start to cry when their blood pressure is normalized, or they can use less insulin or less other diabetic medications. It's astonishing, and the savings. And what I realized that these poor communities are wasting so much money on medication. They're eating the sugar and the refined carbohydrates, and then they've got to be given the medications. Well, maybe the state's paying for it, but someone's paying for all that money.
They're doubly fleeced.
Exactly.
Money for bad food and then money for compensatory, actually weak medications that don't even do much.
And so what's happening, and that money is going out to the pharmaceutical industry, and it's leaving it's leaving the community. And my point is, politicians, why don't you save that money and put it back in the community? And then we can start building those communities.
And productivity will improve also, because people on low carb diet, when they improve their bloods and their risk and everything, also there's a lot around kind of neurological benefits and feeling better. I know it's anecdotal, there's a lot of N equals.
No, you ask those communities and they'll start telling you the whole family starts changing. And there's, there's so much violence in these poorer communities, and you wonder if the violence is linked to nutrition.
At least to some extent, to maybe a large extent, it will be. But if you fixed all the nutrition, then you'd find out, and you might actually get a surprise at how much. So I think next steps for you then. What's your next books out, or after the trial? When is the trial? The next 8 days?
October the 17th for 8 days.
Okay.
And by then the judge will give her decision some months after. And as soon as she's given it, then my revised book will be out. Okay. And so at the moment we're working on a website for doctors. That's going to be the focus now.
Okay.
It's providing information to doctors across the globe, but maybe focusing in South Africa, so that they can go and read the real hard science and the practical stuff about what's important in nutrition. And so hopefully that will encourage the doctors to change, because every doctor who changes probably changes 10,000 people in their practice. And so the multiplier effect is huge. So that's the next focus that we're going to be acting on. And as far as books go, I've got to revise Law of Running, so that revising the chapter out and revising the whole focus. Because the focus was on carbohydrates as the key to performance. Yeah. But I realized actually the book's all about, it was about nutrition, it was about the brain in performance and training. And so now I'm going to say, okay, we start with the brain. This is what the brain does, and this is how you improve your performance through training, and this is how the brain works during exercise. And that's going to be the focus. And I'm also looking at new studies on training, and also the book's fantastic for all the people's athletic careers. I've got a whole bunch, another 5 or 6 or 7 fantastic athletes, and so I'm going to add them in. And then I'm going to try and answer the question, so how should I train? So it's not only how should I eat, but how should I train, which I didn't answer that question. I just gave all the evidence. Right. This is how the people have trained. So now I'm going to try and explain the physiology, and because I don't know what it is, I'm going to have to answer that question. Do we have an answer to how people should train based on physiological principles?
And is there one broad answer, yeah? And how much will it vary between individuals? Is it tweaks, or are there really people that are very different? And in fact, just on that question, the low carb, high fat is certainly the ideal for insulin resistant, which we're saying now is the majority, so that's the ideal diet. And Denise actually was very interesting earlier. There may be a narrow band of people that go to extremes of ultra low fat and achieve an insulin sensitivity in there, but it's kind of bit crazy stuff, but it's interesting. But are there any people who would not do well on a well-balanced, low-carbohydrate, well-formulated diet?
Yeah, I think there are. There are going to be some genetic variants, but I mean it's going to be 1 person in 10,000.
That's what I'm assuming, because I've never really come across any substantial science.
I do get some criticisms from cardiologists whose, for example, their triglycerides suddenly shoot up. Now the triglycerides must go down on this diet, but they shoot up. Okay. And therefore there's something, it's very, very, very unusual. And there are patients who develop fatty liver on this diet, which can't happen, but it happens. So there has to be genetic variants. I mean, the most classic is the carnitine-palmitoyl transferase deficiency, which I knew about 40 years ago. And that if you put them on a low carbohydrate diet, they develop muscle damage, because they can only oxidize carbohydrates, they can't oxidize fat. And I mean, that's well known. So, but how rare is that? There are about 20 cases in the history of medicine.
They should be identified by their unusual blood reaction and then just dealt with specially.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But in terms of maybe a 10% or 15%
No
of
way.
people,
It's never
there's
gonna
no
be.
way.
It's never
I
gonna
agree. Yeah.
It's going to be at maximum 0.5%.
Yeah.
That's what and that's at absolute maximum.
Yeah. No.
Because
For
those-
all of them added together,
Yeah.
a cluster of
Of
rare.
all those rare
yeah.
genetic disorders.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they get reported in the media and in the press and in the scientific press as well.
They get pumped. I've
Yeah.
seen that. And even the lady this morning who asked you about the ketoacidosis,
Ketoacidosis, yeah.
I think I know what she's referring to.
There is a
couple of
paper.
ladies who were.
There was a lady
pregnant.
starving during
Starving.
pregnancy and during lactation, and she was starving and she was eating a high carbohydrate diet. She was not on a high fat diet, and she admitted.
But it was sold to the media
Yeah,
as
that's right.
yeah, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
Well, they have a lot of revenue to protect. It's enormous, and I suppose you can understand that
Indeed.
at some level. So, are there any other just things to highlight, or it's been an excellent chat, and
No, I'm really excited that I'm beginning to understand insulin resistance, and that's what we've got to focus on, and just hope that people will understand that. As I spoke today about insulin resistance being the driver of all these conditions, that they are not separate diseases, they're all the same.
they're all one continuum.
They're all one continuum,
Yes.
and we've got to treat the insulin resistance. And if we could just get that message across
alone.
that's all we have to say. And the outcomes would be stupendous.
And to young, budding doctors out there, that's what you got to know about. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Tim.
Ivan.
Delighted.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.